All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're going deep on 18th century Prussia. You sent us a whole bunch of articles on Frederick the Great, even some
Yeah.
Wikipedia excerpts.
Yeah,
So clearly you're interested in more than just the battles and the politics.
right.
We're going to unpack the man behind the military genius and, spoiler alert, his personal life.
Yeah.
Anything but boring.
It really is fascinating, isn't it? For centuries, historians kind of, danced around Frederick's sexuality. But recent scholarship, it's brought a whole new perspective. We're finally starting to get a more honest, more nuanced look at this complex figure.
Okay, so let's start with Frederick's early life.
Yeah.
We have these Wikipedia excerpts that really paint a picture of his relationship with his father, King Frederick William's son.
Yeah.
And, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly father of the year material.
No, not at all. Frederick William, he was totally fixated on creating this powerful, militaristic Prussia, like the epitome of masculinity.
Right.
And young Frederick, he didn't exactly fit the mold.
No. The articles mention that Frederick actually confided in his mentor, saying that he felt very little attraction to women. I mean, that must have been pretty shocking at the time.
Oh, absolutely. Remember, we're talking about 18th century Prussia, defying social norms, especially regarding sexuality. For someone like Frederick, it was unthinkable.
Yeah. And it wasn't just rumors, right? We also have accounts from his sister, Wilhelmine.
Right.
She observed Frederick's relationships with some of the pages at court, these young men.
Yeah, and Wilhelmine's writings, they give us this really valuable insight into the whole court dynamic. They definitely suggest a level of intimacy between Frederick and these pages that went beyond, just typical friendships.
I can only imagine how King Frederick William felt about all of this.
Yeah.
It must have felt like his whole plan for this strong Prussia was falling apart.
Yeah, his reaction, it was explosive. He saw these relationships as a direct challenge to his vision for the dynasty. Like, in his eyes, it threatened to undermine this image of strength, this virility that he was so desperate to project. And there was one relationship in particular with a page named Hans Hermann von Katte.
Okay.
That ended tragically.
Tragically? What do you mean?
Well, Frederick William, he was convinced that Frederick and Katte were romantically involved.
Yeah.
And he had Katte arrested and sentenced to death. He saw their bond as scandalous, a threat to the stability of the Prussian throne.
Wow. That's extreme. Surely someone stepped in.
Well, Emperor Charles VI, he was a pretty powerful figure in European politics at the time.
Right.
He actually pleaded for Frederick's life. The king was furious, but he couldn't exactly ignore the emperor's request, So instead of executing Frederick, he confined him to Kustrin. It's a fortress town.
So essentially imprisonment.
Yeah.
That must have been a horrific experience for Frederick, to witness his friend's execution and then face imprisonment himself. Do you think this experience, did it shape his later reign?
It's hard to say for sure, but, it's definitely possible. Imagine the psychological impact of something like that. It must have instilled this sense of caution in him, of secrecy, forcing him to become more guarded about his personal life.
Right. So after all this turmoil, Frederick finally ascends to the throne. Did he continue to surround himself with these close male companions?
He did, absolutely. And one figure who really stands out is Michael Gabriel Fredersdorf.
Right.
He was Frederick's valet, but their relationship definitely much deeper than just, employer and employee.
Yeah. The sources actually mentioned that Fredersdorf rose through the ranks really quickly.
Yes.
After Frederick became king.
Yes.
Was there speculation about the nature of their relationship even back then?
Oh, there definitely was. Some historians, like Eva Zieber, she suggests that they might have been sexually involved, at least in the early years of their relationship. They point to Fredersdorf's, his rapid rise in status, and then later the intimate nature of their correspondence. Like, they even discussed personal health issues with each other.
That's a pretty deep level of trust and intimacy. Not something you usually see between, a king and a servant.
You're right. It points to a bond that went way beyond their official roles. And Fredersdorf wasn't the only man who held this kind of prominent position in Frederick's court. There was also Dietrich von Kaiserling. He was nicknamed the Caesarian, and everyone knew he was very close to the king.
And the articles even mentioned that Frederick had this tendency to promote handsome soldiers to his personal service. It's starting to sound like a bit of a pattern here.
It does, doesn't it? It's becoming clear that Frederick surrounded himself with this select group of men who held his trust and his affection, and this pattern. It goes beyond just his close relationships. Let's look at his artistic expressions, his poetry, his art collection. Frederick's artistic side is it's really a fascinating window into his inner world.
Yeah.
Take his poetry, for instance. There's this poem, La Jouissance,
Yeah.
discovered in 2011, and it really caused a stir among historians.
What's so special about this poem?
Well, the subject matter is it's ambiguous. It's led to all these debates about whether it describes a heterosexual encounter or a homosexual one. The language is veiled, but the intimacy, it's undeniable.
So even back then, people were reading between the lines, trying to figure out the hidden meanings in art. Sounds familiar.
It does, doesn't it?
But what about his art collection? The outline mentions homoerotic themes.
Yes. His collection is full of interesting choices. For example, there's the Temple of Friendship at Sanssouci, Frederick's summer palace. Now, on the surface, it seems like a tribute to his sister, Wilhelmine, but the temple's design, the decorations, they actually celebrate homoerotic attachments from Greek antiquity.
It sounds like he was sending a subtle message through art and architecture.
Exactly. It's a form of expression that allows for a certain level of plausible deniability while still conveying those personal preferences.
Right.
Then there's the prominent placement of the fresco Ganymede is introduced to Olympus in the new palace. I mean, it's a striking image. It would have been hard to miss for anyone visiting the palace.
For those of us who aren't art historians, can you explain the significance of that image?
Well, Ganymede, he was this beautiful youth in Greek mythology, and he was abducted by Zeus, the king of the gods, and the story, often interpreted as an allegory for same-sex love and desire. So having that image in Frederick's palace, pretty bold statement.
That is fascinating. It really sounds like he was carefully curating an environment that reflected his personal inclinations. And what about the Berlin Aderant statue?
Ah, yes. Frederick was particularly fascinated by that statue because he believed it represented Antinous,
Okay.
the lover of Roman Emperor Hadrian.
Right.
Antinous' beauty was legendary, and his relationship with Hadrian. Well documented, though viewed with disapproval by some, of course. But by acquiring this statue, Frederick was, in a way, connecting himself to this historical precedent of same-sex love, within a position of power.
So even if we don't have a diary entry explicitly stating I am gay, these artistic choices really speak volumes about Frederick's desires and interests.
They do. They provide this nuanced understanding of his internal world, especially during a time when being openly gay was dangerous, socially unacceptable.
Speaking of fascinating individuals, we can't forget Frederick's connection to renowned philosopher Voltaire. I mean, I know from the sources you provided, their relationship was a real roller coaster: admiration, betrayal, reconciliation.
Yeah. It really reads like a historical drama. They were both intellectual giants of the Enlightenment, attracted to each other's wit, their unconventional views.
And I'm curious, how did Voltaire's own views on sexuality align with what we know about Frederick's life?
That's a great question. Well, Voltaire, for his time, was surprisingly open-minded about same-sex relationships. In his Dictionnaire philosophique, he even included an entry on love in the manner of Socrates, and he lists historical figures known for same-sex attractions, essentially normalizing it, within the context of history.
Wow, that's pretty bold for the 18th century.
It was.
Do you think this shared perspective, do you think that contributed to their initial bond?
It's certainly possible. I mean, they both challenged societal norms. They were both drawn to this intellectual discourse that pushed boundaries. Frederick even invited Voltaire to live with him in Potsdam, his royal residence. Can you imagine the conversations they must have had there?
Oh, I would give anything for a time machine just to eavesdrop on those discussions. But their friendship, it wasn't all sunshine and roses, was it?
No, it was a complex relationship, lots of drama. Voltaire, he had a knack for getting into feuds, and his sharp tongue often landed him in trouble, even with Frederick.
So what was the final straw? What led to their falling out?
There were a few things, but the most significant event was Voltaire's publication of Le Diatribe du Docteur Akakia.
Okay.
It was a scathing satire aimed at Maupertuis, the president of Frederick's Academy of Sciences,
Oh, I see.
and the king. furious.
It sounds like Voltaire had a talent for poking the bear.
Yeah.
How did Frederick react?
He ordered the pamphlet to be publicly burned, and he placed Voltaire under house arrest.
Wow.
It was a dramatic escalation of their disagreements, and it really marked a turning point in their relationship.
That's a mess.
Yeah.
Did they ever reconcile after such a public display of animosity?
They did eventually, but their friendship never quite the same. And the drama didn't end there.
Oh no, there's more.
Remember those satirical poems Frederick wrote, mocking other rulers?
Yep.
Well, it seems Voltaire took some of them with him when he left Prussia.
Oh.
These poems, potentially scandalous, they could have created a diplomatic nightmare for Frederick if they fell into the wrong hands.
So he essentially had blackmail material on the king. That's bold.
It was.
What did Frederick do?
He wasn't going to let Voltaire use those poems against him, so he had his agents detain Voltaire in Frankfurt and force him to hand over the poems.
Wow. Things got pretty intense. Did Voltaire just accept this defeat?
Not exactly. A few years later, this pamphlet titled Vie privée du roi de Prusse started circulating, and guess who was behind it?
Let me guess. Voltaire seeking revenge.
You got it. The pamphlet was full of juicy gossip about Frederick's private life, details about his relationships with young men.
So he essentially outed the king to all of Europe. That's a pretty big power move.
It was a bold move, and it could have had significant consequences for Frederick's reputation.
Yeah.
Though it's worth noting that rumors about Frederick's sexuality, they were already circulating, in various circles.
Right. It's amazing how gossip travels even across centuries. But amidst all of these relationships with men, is there any evidence of Frederick having relationships with women?
There is one intriguing possibility. Anna Karolina Warzelska,
Okay.
the illegitimate daughter of King Augustus II of Poland.
Okay, tell me more about her. Was she a powerful figure in her own right?
She wasn't a major political player, but she's a fascinating character. The sources mentioned that she was fond of men's clothing, and she enjoyed, activities typically associated with men, like riding, hunting.
Sounds like she was ahead of her time. And how did Frederick fit into her story?
Well, apparently he was smitten with her when he was just a teenager.
Hmm.
He even dedicated poems and musical compositions to her,
Wow.
suggesting a certain level of infatuation.
So maybe Frederick wasn't exclusively interested in men after all.
It's possible, but the evidence is it's murky. Some historians see this relationship as an attempt by others, particularly Frederick's sister Wilhelmine, to downplay his same-sex attractions.
It's interesting how history can be shaped by those who write it.
Yeah.
Were there any other potential romantic interest on the female side?
Not really. The bulk of the evidence points towards a consistent preference for male companions throughout Frederick's life.
All right, let's shift gears a bit and talk about what people were saying about Frederick during his time.
Yeah.
What did his contemporaries, what did they think about his preferences?
Well, it's no surprise that rumors were swirling. I mean, remember, we even have his own father calling him sodomite and effeminate.
Right.
Those were harsh words even for the 18th century.
It's sad to hear such hurtful language, especially from his own father. But was this just idle gossip within the Prussian court, or does it extend beyond those circles?
Oh, it definitely went beyond Prussia's borders. Voltaire, as you know, alluded to it in his writings, and other figures like Giacomo Casanova, the infamous Venetian adventurer and memoirist. He also mentioned Frederick's proclivities in his accounts.
Wow, so it seems Frederick's reputation preceded him. Did anyone else of note comment on his personal life?
William Hogarth, the English painter and social critic, is believed to have subtly depicted Frederick in his painting, The Toilet. Some art historians interpret the painting as a commentary on Frederick's sexuality, with imagery that alludes to same-sex relationships.
So they were throwing shade at the king through art. That's pretty clever and risky.
It was a way of commenting on social and political matters without directly naming names. It shows how widely known Frederick's reputation was, even if it wasn't something openly discussed in polite society.
It makes you wonder how Frederick managed to rule a country like Prussia while facing all of this scrutiny, this judgment.
It's a fascinating question. It speaks to the complexities of his character and the delicate balance he had to maintain between his public persona and his private life.
Yeah. And this brings us to another interesting aspect of Frederick's story, how how historians have chosen to portray him over the centuries.
Yes.
Okay, let's talk about that. It sounds like there's a lot to unpack when it comes to the historical interpretations of Frederick's life.
Absolutely. The way his sexuality has been treated in historical accounts, it's a story in itself, really. It reflects evolving societal attitudes, biases. It reveals a lot about how we choose to remember and interpret figures from the past.
So for a long time, it seems like historians were happy to present this very specific and maybe sanitized version of Frederick the Great.
You're right. For decades, the focus was really on his military achievements, his political reforms, his role as an Enlightenment figure, his personal life, especially his sexuality. It was either, downplayed or completely ignored.
It's like they were trying to fit him into this neat little box, erasing anything that didn't fit the image of this powerful, virtuous king.
Exactly. It reflects a broader tendency in historical writing to conform to societal expectations and norms.
Right.
Especially when you're dealing with figures who are considered heroes, national icons.
So when did this start to change? When did historians start to acknowledge and explore Frederick's sexuality more openly?
Well, the shift really began in the late 19th, early 20th centuries.
Okay.
It was a time when discussions about sexuality, while still controversial, were starting to emerge in intellectual circles. And it's interesting, some of the earliest acknowledgments of Frederick's sexuality actually came from homosexual publications in Weimar Germany.
Really? I wouldn't have expected that from Germany in the early 20th century.
Yeah, it might seem unexpected, but Weimar Germany, it was a period of relative openness, tolerance for LGBTQ individuals. And these publications, they celebrated Frederick as a gay ruler. They praised his ability to govern effectively while being true to himself. They even featured him on their covers.
That's a stark contrast to how he was being portrayed in mainstream historical narratives at the time. But then, of course, came the Nazi era, and I imagine things took a dark turn.
Sadly, you're right. The Nazi regime, with its rigid ideology of racial purity and hypermasculinity,
right,
it suppressed any positive representation of homosexuality. It was seen as a threat to their vision of a strong, unified Germany.
So any mention of Frederick's sexuality was basically erased from public discourse during that period.
Essentially, yes. It became a taboo subject again. However, it's worth noting that even during this oppressive time, there were writers, intellectuals who, despite the risks, continued to explore the complexities of Frederick's character in their works. Joachim Klepper, he was a German writer and resistance fighter.
Okay.
He actually wrote a play about Frederick that subtly hinted at his same-sex attractions. It was a brave act of defiance against the Nazi regime.
It's incredible how Frederick's story has been woven into different historical and political narratives, each one reflecting the prevailing social attitudes of the time. But even today, there seems to be a reluctance among some historians to fully engage with his sexuality. Why do you think that is?
It's a complex issue. I mean, some historians might argue that his personal life is irrelevant to his political achievements, his legacy as a ruler. Others might still feel uncomfortable with the topic or fear backlash from a society that, despite progress, still harbors prejudices against LGBTQ individuals.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how many other historical figures have been misrepresented or misunderstood because of their sexuality.
That's a really important point. The tendency to erase or downplay the complexities of historical figures' lives, especially when it comes to sexuality, it does a disservice to our understanding of the past. It creates this distorted and incomplete picture of history.
So after all this deep diving into Frederick the Great's life, what can we definitively say about his sexuality?
Well, based on the evidence we have, his close relationships with men, his artistic choices, the accounts from his contemporaries, it's highly likely that Frederick was primarily attracted to men.
Okay.
However, it's important to remember that we're looking at the past through a modern lens. We can't impose our 21st century understanding of sexuality onto an 18th century figure.
Right. We can't definitively label him with modern terms or categories.
Exactly. What's more important is to acknowledge the complexities of his life and avoid, simplifying his story to fit this neat narrative. By examining the historical evidence carefully, thoughtfully, we can gain a deeper understanding of Frederick the Great as a complex, multifaceted individual whose personal life was undoubtedly intertwined with his political role.
And that's what makes history so fascinating, right? It's not just about dates and battles.
Right.
It's about people, real people with their own desires, their own struggles, their own contradictions.
Absolutely. Exploring the personal lives of historical figures like Frederick the Great helps us humanize them. It reminds us that they weren't just, larger than life figures in textbooks, but individuals who navigated the complexities of their time just as we do today.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what would you say is the most important takeaway for our listener when it comes to understanding Frederick the Great?
I think the key takeaway is that history is rarely black and white. It's full of nuance, contradiction, untold stories. And when we approach history with curiosity and open mind, we uncover a richer, more complete understanding of the past and the individuals who shaped it.
And sometimes those untold stories can be pretty intriguing. Frederick the Great's life is a prime example. His sexuality, far from being a footnote, it's an integral part of his story. It offers valuable insights into his character, his motivations, the challenges he faced as a ruler. So, to our listener, I encourage you to continue exploring this fascinating historical figure, delve deeper into the sources, question the narratives you encounter, draw your own conclusions. History is a conversation, and we invite you to be a part of it.